Dad perfect events. I switched my son-in-law's chair on his wedding day. It was the quietest decision I ever made and the coldest one of my life. No one knew that the chair he was about to sit in had been prepared to humiliate my wife in front of 200 people. No one knew my own daughter was standing guard to make sure that plan went through. And no one imagined that I had seen everything from the very beginning. My name is Harold Ferguson. I'm 58 years old, and I built Ferguson Properties from nothing. That morning, at a wedding that cost $150,000, the dirtiest thing wasn't on the floor. It was inside people's hearts. Let me take you back to that morning, when everything still looked like a perfect day. But first, you need to understand how we got here. I started Ferguson Properties 30 years ago, with a $5,000 loan and a pickup truck. Back then, Charleston was different. You could still buy waterfront lots for reasonable money if you knew where to look. I spent my days pouring concrete and my nights studying property law. Beverly would pack my lunch every morning and kiss me goodbye before I headed out to job sites that might not even pay me. Those early years were brutal. I remember one winter when we had $47 in our checking account, and Nancy was 3 years old. Beverly was clipping coupons, and I was working 16-hour days just to keep us afloat. But we never talked about quitting. That's not who we are. The military taught me discipline, but building a business from scratch taught me patience. You learn to read people when your livelihood depends on whether they'll pay their bills on time. You develop instincts about who you can trust and who's looking for an angle. By year 10, we owned 15 properties. By year 20, we had commercial developments across 3 counties. Today, Ferguson Properties is worth around $50 million. Not bad for a guy who started with a borrowed pickup truck. Beverly stood behind every decision. She never wanted her name on the business cards or her picture in the newspaper articles. But when I had to choose between a risky investment and playing it safe, when I had to decide whether to trust a new partner or walk away from a deal, I always talked to Beverly first. She has this way of seeing through people's words to what they really mean. Nancy grew up watching us build something together. She saw the late nights, the difficult conversations, the celebrations when we closed a big deal. I thought she understood that success comes from hard work and smart decisions. I thought she learned that family means having each other's backs no matter what. I was wrong about that. Nancy's 28 now, works in marketing at a firm downtown. She's always been Daddy's little girl, still calls me for advice about everything from car repairs to apartment hunting. When she was 16, I taught her to drive in the empty parking lot behind our first office building. When she graduated college, I gave her the pearl necklace that belonged to Beverly's grandmother. 2 years ago, she brought Timothy Collins home for dinner. I knew something was off the moment I shook his hand. Not because of anything obvious. He said all the right things, brought flowers for Beverly, complimented the house. But there was something in his eyes when he looked around our dining room, like he was calculating the value of everything he saw. Timothy's 30, a corporate lawyer who specializes in mergers and acquisitions. He went to good schools, drives a nice car, wears expensive suits. On paper, he looked perfect for Nancy. But I've been in business long enough to know that the people who look perfect on paper are sometimes the ones you need to watch most carefully. The first red flag came 3 months after they started dating. Nancy mentioned that Timothy was asking questions about Ferguson Properties, how many employees we had, what our annual revenue looked like, whether I had succession plans in place. She thought he was just showing interest in her family's business. I thought he was conducting due diligence. Over the next year, those questions got more specific. Timothy wanted to know about our debt-to-equity ratio, our property portfolio breakdown, who handled our legal work. He'd ask these things casually, usually when we were having family dinners or watching football games. Nancy would smile and nudge him, telling him he was being too much of a lawyer. Beverly tried to welcome Timothy into the family. She invited him to holiday dinners, asked about his work, remembered his birthday. I watched how he responded to her kindness. Polite enough, but with this underlying impatience, like he was tolerating a necessary inconvenience. That should have been red flag number 2. The third red flag was how he talked about money. Timothy grew up comfortable, private school, summer camps, college paid for by his parents. But he talked about wealth like it was something he deserved rather than something you earned. He'd make comments about old money versus new money, about how important it was to maintain a certain lifestyle. Nancy ate it up. She started talking differently about our house, our cars, our social circle. Like she was suddenly embarrassed by the family that had given her everything she'd ever needed. But I kept my mouth shut. Nancy was an adult, and if she wanted to marry a guy who saw dollar signs when he looked at our family, that was her choice to make. I just hoped she'd figure out what kind of man she was marrying before it was too late. The engagement came 18 months after they met. Timothy proposed at a fancy restaurant downtown, had the whole thing photographed by a professional. Nancy called us crying happy tears, talking about how romantic it was, how Timothy had planned every detail perfectly. Beverly was thrilled. She immediately started talking about wedding dresses and flower arrangements. I smiled and congratulated them, but privately I wondered if Timothy had planned the proposal the same way he planned his business deals, with an eye toward the maximum return on investment. The wedding planning started immediately. Nancy and Timothy came to our house the week after the engagement, with a folder full of ideas and a budget that made my accountant's eyes water. They wanted Charleston Harbor for the ceremony, the historic mansion for the reception, and enough flowers to stock a small nursery. It's important for Timothy's firm, Nancy explained, spreading photos across our kitchen table. His partners will be there, and some of their biggest clients. We need to make the right impression. Beverly nodded along, asking questions about color schemes and menu options. I sat there doing math in my head. $150,000 for one day. More than most people make in 3 years. But Nancy looked so happy, and Timothy kept talking about how this would be an investment in their future together. I wrote the check, not because I cared about impressing lawyers, but because I wanted my daughter to have the wedding of her dreams, even if those dreams were being shaped by someone else's ambitions. The real problem started about 3 weeks before the wedding. Timothy asked if he could stop by the office to discuss some family business matters. He showed up with a leather briefcase and the kind of serious expression lawyers wear when they're about to deliver bad news. "Harold," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "I've been thinking about succession planning for Ferguson Properties. Nancy and I want to make sure the family business is protected for future generations." He pulled out a stack of documents, neatly organized with colored tabs. I took the liberty of having some preliminary agreements drafted. Nothing binding, of course, just exploring options. I flipped through the pages, feeling my blood pressure rise with each paragraph. These weren't succession plans. They were sale documents, preliminary agreements to explore selling Ferguson Properties to a development group out of Atlanta. The numbers were there, the terms were outlined, and there was a signature line marked clearly for my approval. "This is interesting," I said, keeping my voice level. "But I don't remember asking for a sale evaluation." Timothy leaned forward, using his best lawyer voice. "The market is really strong right now, Harold. Commercial real estate in Charleston is at an all-time high. If we're ever going to maximize the value of what you've built, now might be the time. Maximize the value for who? For the family, of course, Nancy's future, potential grandchildren. You've worked hard your whole life. Maybe it's time to enjoy the fruits of that labor." I set the documents down and looked at Timothy carefully. And what would I do with myself if I sold the company? Retire, travel with Beverly, play golf? Isn't that what you've been working toward? The thing is, he wasn't entirely wrong. I am 58 years old. I have been working for 30 years. But Ferguson Properties isn't just a business to me. It's everything I built for my family. It's Nancy's inheritance, her children's future, the legacy I wanted to leave behind. More importantly, I never asked Timothy to evaluate my retirement plans. "I'll think about it," I told him, sliding the documents back across the desk. Timothy smiled that practiced smile. "Of course. No rush. But the Atlanta group is only in town for another few weeks. If we want to move forward, we need to act fairly quickly." After he left, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at those documents. Everything about them felt wrong. The timing, the pressure, the fact that Timothy had gone ahead and had them drafted without asking me first. But what bothered me most was how confident he seemed that I'd eventually sign them. Like it was inevitable. Like he'd already figured out exactly how to get what he wanted. I decided to do some investigating of my own. I called a friend who works in corporate law, asked him about the Atlanta Development Group. Turns out they're legitimate, but they're known for buying family businesses, stripping out the valuable assets, and flipping the properties to national chains. That's when I realized what Timothy really wanted. He wasn't interested in preserving what I'd built. He wanted to cash out as quickly as possible, take his share, and move on to the next opportunity. The wedding planning continued, but I started paying closer attention to the conversations happening around me. Timothy would make comments about outdated business models and maximizing efficiency. Nancy would talk about how they planned to travel after the wedding, maybe look at houses in more sophisticated areas. Beverly noticed the change in my mood. "You've been quiet lately," she said one evening, while we were walking on the beach behind our house. "Everything okay?" I told her about the documents, about Timothy's pressure to sell. Beverly listened without interrupting, the way she always does when I need to work through a problem out loud. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think Timothy sees dollar signs when he looks at our family," she said quietly. "And I think Nancy's so in love that she can't see it yet. So, what do I do?" Beverly stopped walking and turned to face me. "You protect what you built, Harold. And you protect our daughter, even if she doesn't know she needs protecting." 2 weeks before the wedding, Timothy's true colors started showing more clearly. He began asking more direct questions about the business. Who had signing authority? Where we kept important documents? What would happen if I became incapacitated? Nancy thought he was being responsible, planning for their future together. I thought he was conducting reconnaissance. The final straw came 5 days before the wedding. I was in my home office when I heard voices from downstairs. Timothy was there for dinner, but he'd arrived early. I could hear him talking to Nancy in the kitchen. "Your parents are great people," he was saying, "but they're stuck in the past. That business could be worth so much more if it was managed properly." "What do you mean?" Nancy asked. "I mean, your dad is too sentimental. He's holding on to properties that should be developed, refusing deals that would triple your family's net worth. When we're married, maybe I can help him see the bigger picture." I sat there listening to my son-in-law-to-be explain how he planned to fix everything that was wrong with my life's work, how he'd help me see the bigger picture of my own business. That's when I knew for certain that Timothy Collins wasn't marrying my daughter out of love. He was marrying her for access to Ferguson properties, access to 30 years of my hard work, access to everything I'd built for my family's future. The wedding morning started like any other day that would change everything. I woke up at 5:30, made coffee, and sat in my home office looking out over Charleston Harbor. The wedding setup crew was already working on the beach, arranging white chairs in the perfect rows. Everything looked peaceful and beautiful. I should have felt proud. My only daughter was getting married in a few hours. Instead, I felt like I was watching someone prepare a trap. Beverly was already up, helping Nancy get ready upstairs. I could hear laughter and music coming from the bridal suite. Normal sounds for a wedding morning, but nothing about this day felt normal to me anymore. Around 8 a.m., I decided to walk down to the setup area to check on the progress. The crew was working efficiently. They'd done dozens of weddings at this venue. White fabric draped in the ocean breeze, flowers arranged perfectly, a small platform set up for the ceremony. Everything exactly as Nancy had dreamed. I was heading back to the house when I heard voices from the side porch. Timothy was there with 3 of his college buddies, all of them dressed in matching groomsmen tuxedos. They were drinking coffee and laughing about something. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but when you hear your wife's name mentioned, you stop and listen. "Beverly's going to love being the center of attention today," Timothy was saying, and something in his tone made my stomach clench. "What do you mean?" one of his friends asked. "Let's just say the mother-in-law is going to get exactly what she deserves. Something to remember her place in the family hierarchy." The laughter that followed was the kind that makes your skin crawl. Not good-natured wedding humor, something meaner. I stayed where I was, hidden by the corner of the porch, and listened to Timothy describe what he called his surprise gift for the family photos. He didn't give details, but he talked about how Beverly was always trying to steal the spotlight and how today she'd learned some humility. His friends thought it was hilarious. They made jokes about putting the old lady in her place and teaching her some respect. Timothy ate up a word of encouragement. What made me sickest wasn't just what they were saying, it was how Timothy talked about Beverly, like she was some kind of problem that needed to be solved, rather than the woman who had welcomed him into our family with open arms. I walked away before they could see me, but I made a mental note to keep my eyes open during the setup process. If Timothy had planned some kind of humiliation for Beverly, I wanted to know what it was before it happened. 2 hours later, I was walking through the reception area when I saw Timothy near the family seating section. He'd changed into his wedding tuxedo, but didn't have his jacket on yet. Nancy was about 20 feet away, talking to the photographer, but I noticed she kept glancing over at Timothy like she was keeping watch. I ducked behind one of the decorative columns the wedding planner had installed. From there, I could see Timothy clearly as he bent down next to the chair marked with Beverly's nameplate. From a small canvas bag, he pulled out a tube of industrial adhesive. I recognized it immediately. We use the same brand on construction sites, the kind that bonds materials permanently, designed to hold metal and wood together under extreme conditions. Timothy squeezed a thick, clear layer across the entire seat of Beverly's chair. He worked carefully, making sure the adhesive was evenly distributed, but not visible from a standing position. When he finished, he capped the tube and slipped it back into the bag. Nancy appeared beside him and said something I couldn't quite hear, but I caught the words family photos and saw her point toward the photographer's staging area. Timothy nodded and smiled, like they were discussing flower arrangements instead of planning to humiliate my wife. That's when everything clicked into place. They weren't just planning to embarrass Beverly. They were planning to destroy her dignity during the most public moment of the entire wedding, when the photographer would gather everyone for formal family portraits, when Beverly would try to stand up gracefully for pictures, when 200 guests would be watching. The adhesive would keep her stuck to the chair. Her dress would tear when she tried to stand. She'd be trapped and humiliated in front of everyone we knew, everyone Timothy worked with, everyone Nancy had invited to witness her perfect day. I watched Timothy walk away, actually whistling under his breath. Nancy followed behind him, checking her phone like nothing had happened. They looked like any normal couple handling last-minute wedding details. But I knew better. I'd just witnessed my son-in-law carefully plan to humiliate my wife, and my daughter had stood guard to make sure he could do it. I stayed behind that column for several more minutes, thinking about what I'd seen. The old herald might have confronted them immediately, might have grabbed Timothy by his fancy tuxedo and demanded an explanation, might have called off the wedding right then and there. But 30 years in business teaches you patience. It teaches you to observe before you act. And it teaches you that sometimes the best response to someone's carefully laid plan is to let them fall into their own trap. I looked at Beverly's chair, still wet with adhesive. Then I looked at the head table where the bride and groom would sit during the reception, right in the center of attention, right where every photographer would focus, right where everyone would expect to see the happy couple. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Timothy wanted to humiliate someone during the family photos? Fine. But he was going to learn that when you set a trap for someone else, you better make sure you're not the one who ends up sitting in it. I waited until the setup area was completely empty. Then I walked over to Beverly's chair and carefully removed her nameplate. The adhesive was still wet, thick and clear like honey. I didn't need to touch it to know what it would do to someone's dress. The head table sat on a small platform, elevated so everyone could see the bride and groom during the reception. Nancy's chair was positioned right in the center, the place of honor where all the photographers would focus, where every toast would be directed. I switched the nameplates. Beverly's clean chair went back to the family section. Nancy's chair, the one that would be the center of everyone's attention, now had Timothy's surprise waiting underneath. I adjusted everything carefully, made sure it looked perfect. When I stepped back, nobody would ever know anything had changed. I looked like any father making sure his daughter's wedding was set up correctly. The ceremony went exactly as planned. Timothy and Nancy exchanged vows with steady voices. Nancy looked beautiful in Beverly's grandmother's lace dress, altered to fit her perfectly. Timothy kept glancing toward the family section where Beverly sat, and I caught him smiling slightly. He thought his plan was working perfectly. After the I-do's and the traditional kiss, everyone moved toward the reception area. I watched Timothy offer Nancy his arm as they walked to the head table. She had no idea she was walking toward the trap her husband had set for her mother. Vernon Hayes, our MC, started the reception with the usual toasts and introductions. Nancy and Timothy sat at their head table, waving to guests, posing for photos. Everything looked picture perfect for about 20 minutes. Then Vernon announced it was time for the bride's remarks, followed by the special family tribute video. Nancy would speak first, then remain standing for photos during the video presentation. I watched from my seat as Nancy placed her hands on the arms of her chair and started to stand. For just a second, everything looked normal. Then her expression changed. She pushed harder against the chair arms. Nothing happened. Her body wasn't moving upward. Timothy noticed immediately and leaned. "And now over to whisper something," Nancy whispered back, her voice tight with confusion. She tried again, this time gripping the table edge for leverage. That's when we all heard it. A soft tearing sound, barely audible but somehow carrying across the now quiet reception hall. Nancy's eyes went wide. She looked down at her dress, then at Timothy, panic starting to show on her face. The room began to notice something was wrong. Conversations stopped. People turned toward the head table. Timothy tried to help, putting his hands on Nancy's shoulders to pull her up. The tearing sound came again, louder this time. A collective gasp went through the crowd as part of Nancy's dress separated from the chair. Nancy started crying. Not pretty tears, but real panic crying. She was trapped in front of 200 people, her grandmother's wedding dress being destroyed piece by piece every time someone tried to help her stand. That's when I got up and walked to the front of the room. I took the microphone from Vernon's shaking hands and looked out at the confused guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady, "I think we need to pause for just a moment." Nancy looked up at me with mascara running down her cheeks. Timothy had gone completely pale. "Nancy, sweetheart," I continued, "you might be wondering how industrial strength adhesive got on your chair, the kind we use on construction sites to bond materials permanently." A wave of murmurs went through the crowd. Timothy stepped back from the chair like it was radioactive. "Here's the interesting thing. That wasn't your chair originally. It was your mother's chair. Someone applied that adhesive this morning, planning to humiliate Beverly during the family photos." The room went dead silent. Nancy stopped crying and stared at me with wide eyes. Then she looked at Timothy. "I saw it happen," I said. "I saw who did it, and I saw who was keeping watch to make sure the plan worked." I reached into my jacket and pulled out the sale documents Timothy had given me weeks earlier. And while we're talking about things that were carefully planned, let's discuss these preliminary agreements for Ferguson Properties. Documents that Timothy has been shopping around to buyers in Atlanta, using information he gathered from family dinners. Timothy found his voice. "Harold, you don't understand the full situation." "I understand perfectly," I said. "You wanted to humiliate my wife so you could divide this family. Make it easier to convince Nancy that her parents were holding her back. Then you could pressure me to sell the business and cash out before anyone realized what you'd done." I looked directly at Nancy, still stuck in the chair. "Honey, your husband has been playing a long game. The man you married planned to destroy your mother's dignity and steal your family's business. Today, you got caught in the trap he set for someone else." Nancy looked at Timothy with an expression I'll never forget. Not anger. Recognition, like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. "The good news," I announced to the room, "is that industrial adhesive dissolves with the right solvent. Leonard, my property manager, has some in his truck. Nancy, we'll get you out of there and into a backup dress." I handed the microphone back to Vernon. "The bad news, Timothy, is that planning to defraud a family business and humiliate your wife's mother at her own daughter's wedding are both serious problems. The kind that end careers." Timothy left during the dress change, just walked out to his car and drove away. His family followed. By the time Nancy was free and changed into Beverly's backup dress, half the wedding party was gone. We finished the evening anyway. Nancy handled it with a grace that made me proud. She thanked the remaining guests for their love and patience. She danced with me, while Beverly watched, smiling that calm, trusting smile that had carried us through 32 years of marriage. 6 months. Later, Nancy met Gordon at her book club, a high school teacher who drives a 10-year-old Honda and has never once asked about Ferguson Properties. They've been together over a year now, and I've never seen her happier. As for Timothy, he lost his law license when the Bar Association investigated his business practices. Turns out, using privileged family information to negotiate unauthorized deals violates several ethical standards. I learned something important that day. Family isn't about blood or marriage certificates. It's about who protects you when someone tries to tear you down. It's about respect, not just for what you've built, but for who you are as a person. If someone tries to humiliate the person you love most, tries to steal what you've spent your life building, tries to use your own children against you, sometimes the best response is patience. Let them walk into their own trap. Because people like Timothy are usually their own worst enemy. They just need the right moment to prove it.